This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Welcome to episode 3 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. In this episode, we're going to be talking about staying with local people on your travels. I think staying with locals is one of the best ways to get to know a new city or a new country well. You have an instant connection to some people who know the place and live there, and you tend to be staying outside the main tourist zones, perhaps in a suburb or where the real normal people live. I've got some really interesting guests to tell you today about their really varied experiences staying with locals all around the world. But first up, I just wanted to tell you about one of my great experiences. I've travelled to Russia a couple of times, and the second time was with my mother. She'd learnt the Russian language for a while and was always keen to visit. So I returned and took her to Moscow and St. Petersburg. And in both places, we stayed with locals using a homestay setup. And in St. Petersburg, we stayed with a lovely lady named Valentina. She was new to homestays. I think perhaps we were only her second or third lot of guests. And typically, as I heard, a lot of Russian widows need some extra cash and open up their spare room to homestaying tourists. So there we were, staying quite close to central St. Petersburg. We could walk over into the main downtown area. And staying with Valentina meant we got to eat a proper Russian breakfast every day. We got her tips for where to go. My mum and I fell in love with this particular cafe where they had the most delicious garlic bread, eggplant dishes, all kinds of tasty food. We never would have found it if Valentina hadn't suggested it. It was definitely not on the tourist beat. We got to talk to her about her many, many visits to the Hermitage Museum. She could just walk across the bridge and get there. We were a bit jealous because we spent a day there and could have spent weeks there. And lots of other little tidbits that we picked up from Valentina meant we just felt like we had had a little insight into the way that a real Russian woman lived. And of course, for my mum, who was probably about a similar age, she could practice a bit of her Russian. Valentina didn't speak much English, so they could try and chat together, and that was a really interesting and valuable experience for them as well. And I stayed with lots of other families and other widows across Russia and had some really great experiences, which we'll probably come to at some stage during the podcast, at least in the future. So I want to move on, though, now to our first guest today, Kerstin Pilz from travelpilz.com. She has had lots of interesting experiences staying with locals all around the world. Today she's got some stories for us about Cuba and Japan and other different ways that she's managed to find ways to meet the locals and get a different kind of insight into their world.
I guess the first time I really stayed with locals was in Cuba. I mean, maybe I had other experiences, but in an organized way. And that is when I visited Cuba in 2003. I think they still have them, casas particulares, they were called, and you could stay with the family for $20, I think, and just rent their spare room. And it was a way that Castro allowed them to, make a bit of money on the side. And that was really lovely because for me, actually, it allowed me to learn Spanish because they didn't speak English and I was traveling on my own. And it also meant I had an instant family. I got to Cuba. I was meant to travel through Cuba with a good friend of mine. She had an accident, not a major accident, but something that prevented her from traveling, literally the evening before departure. So I found myself in Miami on my own, in Mexico rather, and then went across to Cuba. And I didn't even have the guidebook on me because she was meant to bring that. And I thought, oh, what do I do now?
That's
and
one way to have a new travel experience. Yes, have nothing because your friend got sick and you're stuck there alone.
Yeah, exactly. And so I actually I can't remember how I ended up with that first family on the Malecon there in Havana, and then they would ring the cousin brother and then the cousin brother, and so I traveled the entire island from one cousin to the next, and it was a wonderful
That's
experience because
fabulous.
so as a solo traveler, it meant I had an instant family, and also I like my solitude. It also meant I didn't feel lonely because I knew I could just go downstairs or outside of my room and chat with with my hosts. So that, and also of course it was a fascinating insight into the culture because I really stayed in these homes, some of which had, were very basic and very different, very different sense also of order and so on. But the rooms were always, perfect, perfectly fine. Yes. And as an Airbnb host, I enjoy that very much. I get lots of very interesting people actually coming to stay in my place. Many, in fact, I have a couple arriving tomorrow. They're, I guess you would call them grey digital nomads
Ah,
from
interesting.
Canada. Yeah, they're bloggers. They have their own blog, and so so that's really interesting. And again, I find with the Airbnb now, I love traveling with Airbnb because I did a 1 week road trip on my own on Kauai in Hawaii. And I was a bit worried because it's honeymoon territory. And what would I do in the evenings? All the couples gazing into each other's eyes, and there's me alone at dinner. Is this going to be fun? Is this stupid? I got an Airbnb and I had instant company. They took me out, or even I went on my own. It didn't matter because I knew I had friends already.
Yeah, that
So
instant local contact and people who are obviously interested in meeting people from other countries or they wouldn't be doing it.
yes,
It's such a great way to
yes,
land in a new place, isn't it?
yes, exactly, yes. And my most recent experience was actually, the recent sort of new experience was with Work Away, which is, I guess, like woofing. I don't know if you've heard of
I know
woofing,
woofing, yeah,
working.
but I don't know much. I don't think I've heard of Workaway. Tell me that.
Yes, a workaway is for people who, woofing is, to work on organic
Organic farm, yeah.
farms, but um, this is for anybody who needs, and from a nanny to somebody helping you with your, I don't know, housework, or in Hawaii, I even saw somebody needed somebody to help them edit a book, and in exchange, you're expected to work between 4 and 5 hours a day. And in exchange, you get free food and board. And so I took my niece to Japan, to the island of Shodoshima in the inland sea. And it was a Japanese mother with two sons. And she had just returned from New Zealand, having lived and been married to an Englishman. So they had grown up bilingually, and she wanted to keep contact with the language. So one week per month, this Japanese lady hosts a foreigner, a traveler, for that person then to spend time with her kids, to speak English to them and help them with the homework and so on. And that was a really valuable way. I wanted to do it to show my niece, who was 16 at the time, how you can travel the world without having a lot of money, and also, what it is like to interact with locals. And she's really got the message. She wants to travel like this now all the time.
Oh, your
And
job here is done. Well done.
yes, that's it. I've totally given her the travel bug. Oh my God.
I really love the way that Kerstin is able to seek out all kinds of different experiences around the world to meet with locals and stay with them. I have a few more ideas to check out myself now as well, and I'll put some links to some of the resources she mentioned in the show notes. Now, our next guests today are Linda and Craig Martin from the Indie Travel podcast. You might remember them from episode 1. They were the couple who were presented with a huge bowl of chopped tomatoes when all they wanted was some red wine in Slovakia. They're also pretty expert at staying with the locals. They've used Couchsurfing a lot as a great way to find a place to stay for little cost and to meet the locals, and have had some really interesting experiences as well. So we chatted about some of these.
We are huge fans of Couchsurfing. We didn't really get into it until that trip to Chile. So we travelled for about 3 years, and we went back to New Zealand, and we learned about Couchsurfing. We were back in New Zealand for a year. And we thought, well, why don't we try this? We'll give it a go. I think we'd done it once. And we basically booked most of our trip in Chile all through Couchsurfing. And it was spectacular. But we've just met some really, really awesome people. I remember when we were in Germany. Germany's a really great place for Couchsurfing. We're going to Dusseldorf, and we're staying with a couple who were just so sweet. We're only there for a weekend, and I wish we could have stayed longer. But we thought we'd be a bit bored because we thought Dusseldorf doesn't sound that interesting. We loved it. But this couple took us out geocaching into a local park, and it was just so much fun. We went to a local vegetarian restaurant where the food was delicious. We're not vegetarians, so that's saying something.
And even more importantly for Dusseldorf, we went out and drank a whole lot of alt beer, which is their special local style of beer at, I don't know, at least half a dozen. My memory is a bit phasy.
Oh, I can't imagine why.
And hazy.
Phasey is a new word.
Phasey, yeah. I'm just coining that right now. Just taken back to that point at about 2 o'clock in the morning after an undisclosed number of these small breweries.
The problem is that when you're out having a beer, they're really small, and when you don't want another one, you take your coaster and you put it on top of your glass, because otherwise they just come around and swap the glasses out and you get a new beer, and they mark the waiters mark the coaster to say how many you've had, and then you pay for them at the end. Perfect. So sometimes we'd put our coaster on top of our glass to indicate we didn't want any more. And the waiter would just come along, take the coaster off, put it down on the table, and put a new beer on it.
So he was just completely overriding your decision there.
That's right. He was saying, no, what, you've only had 2? No, that's completely unacceptable.
That's not the way the locals do it, so you can't either. Have you ever had any couchsurfing experiences that were a bit unusual?
Definitely. One of our craziest couchsurfing experiences was in Peru. So this is part of this first trip where we'd just gone to Chile and then we moved up to Peru. And we had 2 odd experiences there. One was where our friend had organised the couchsurfing. We showed up and our host wasn't there. He just didn't show up. And it was a rather dodgy part of Lima. So there were 5 of us at that time standing around, waiting. We knocked on the door, no answer. We called. We managed to find an open Wi-Fi connection. We sent an email. We really tried everything.
When Linda says this was a reasonably dodgy area, this was the area that the police had told us not to go into. And there were 5 of us at that point standing there with our bags.
Looking very touristy.
With our
kind of vulnerable.
Looking like rich Western backpackers in gangland Lima.
Yeah, so he just never showed up. So we decided to go and have dinner. And when we still couldn't get in touch with him after that, we just went to a hostel. We always had a backup accommodation option, so we went there. And then later that night, or maybe it was the next day, he got in touch with us, said, I'm so sorry, I was in a meeting, I couldn't. And we just thought, we're still not going to go and stay with him because it just wasn't safe.
Couchsurfing's been really good to us, and the way that we travel, we often go somewhere for a few months at a time. And so couchsurfing is a great way for us to get into a city, stay with locals, have them help us to kind of get oriented. Mm-hmm. And quite often they're more than willing to tell us that an apartment over here is a terrible idea, or you probably want to stay in this area. And so that's been a really useful way as a practical example of how we can get under the skin of a city quicker and more easily than we would if we were just kind of booking something on Airbnb before we arrived.
Yeah, that's right. When we were traveling around Spain, and we were going to be in 2 places for 3 or 4 months each. Both times we stayed with a couchsurfing host for the first 3 or 4 days, and then we moved into an apartment. And it was absolutely brilliant. In Jerez particularly, we stayed with this couple called Ana and Diego, and then we moved into our apartment, and Ana and Diego stayed our friends, and they're still our friends. They came to visit us when we were staying in Berlin, and we've seen them in Madrid. So we're still friends with them, and I think that's really great.
I was just thinking that I was going to ask you if you've stayed in contact with some of your couchsurfing hosts. So that's great. What a great way to quickly and easily meet some locals when you arrive somewhere. I love it.
Yeah,
it gives you an instant friendship circle, and that's important when you're traveling because you're quite often isolated from your family and your friends. So having a group of people to fall right into and go to the pub with and meet up for lunch, celebrate birthdays and special events together, it's really a beautiful thing.
I love hearing that Linda and Craig are still friends with some of the people they've couch-surfed with over the years. I think that's the ultimate goal of meeting some locals when you travel. They also told me a funny story earlier in the conversation about a couch surfing stay they had in Chile. a young guy had agreed that they could stay at his house, and they met up with him, Linda, Craig, and 2 other friends, so a group of 4. And he said to them, "No worries, let's go. I just have to call my mother and let her know we're on the way." So his mother didn't know that 4 foreigners were about to land on her doorstep. And I think Linda and Craig were a little bit worried about that. But it turned out to be quite okay, even though the second night they were had agreed to stay was his mother's birthday and some visitors were coming to stay. So it was a bit of a juggle, but it all worked out. And I thought that was such a lovely story of generous hosts opening their homes to travellers. I do love that kind of story. Now, our final guest today is Tim Leffel, who is a travel writer and author of several great books and has also had some really interesting experiences living abroad. But today we chatted about how useful it is to stay near the locals using something like Airbnb to see how the locals live, even if you're not staying directly with them, but to get to know them through daily interactions in their neighbourhoods.
If you're going to have real interactions with locals, you're much more likely to have that if you've been around for a little while and they've seen you more than once and they know that you're not just the guy stepping off the bus, snapping photos and then getting back on the bus again. You know,
that's right.
I think it's easier, but also being in a real neighborhood helps a lot. And I'm really happy that Airbnb has come along and gotten so popular. I know there are other alternatives out there, that they're not the only ones, but it's become a lot more accessible to stay in a real neighborhood, even for just a few nights, where it used to be that you really needed to rent a place for a week or more if you were going to rent a villa or an apartment, flat. But now it's very easy to just even do that for 3 nights, if you go somewhere. So I think you could see a whole different side of a city if you stay in a neighborhood where real people live and they're getting up and going to work and, coming home and going shopping and going out to eat, as opposed to the tourist part of town where everybody's on a whole different schedule and they're eating whole different kind of food and, frequenting different kinds of bars. And I was laughing. I was in Cusco, Peru, when, talking back to that country again, there's this place that says the highest Irish bar in the world. And because it's like at 11,000 feet or whatever, right off the main square in Cusco. And it's like, why do you want to go to an Irish bar if you're in Peru?
I've never understood that.
It's packed, every night.
Of course it is. All the backpackers are there. But why? I know there's Irish pubs are everywhere. To me, I think they belong in Ireland. That's where I go to an Irish pub. But
exactly.
Obviously, you and I are a little bit strange because the big crowds are not doing what we do.
Yeah, but I don't know. I think that's a really good thing to do if you're going to live somewhere too. If you're thinking of, you might live in a certain place, then go rent an apartment in a real neighborhood for a while and see what it's like to actually live there like a real person, and get your laundry done and, get your groceries from 5 different places like you have to do in some countries, and all of that.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. Airbnb and similar, I usually use Airbnb, are just a revolutionary way to easily stay in a local place, a local neighborhood, locals around you. I just love it.
Yeah, it's just so much of a different experience.
Yeah, much more like, because I lived abroad in it for a few years in a few different places, and I was kind of depressed at the end of about the 3rd year, because I'd kind of decided in my head I needed to live 2 years in a place to really get to know it. The first year you're discovering everything around you, and the festivals or whatever happens sort of annually, and then the second year you get to kind of enjoy it a bit like a local. And I sort of calculated I don't have that many years left in life to live all the places that I want to.
That's true.
It was really sad, but thankfully, that's sort of 15 years ago, and since then it's become a lot easier to kind of infiltrate into the local life more quickly and get a better taste of it without having to be there for 2 years. So, and things like Airbnb definitely help that.
Yeah, for sure. And, and back to where do you meet locals and how? I mean, if you're in a neighborhood where they live, it's a whole lot easier than if you're in the tourist zone. They're used to dealing with tourists all day, and they see you as a dollar sign, or a euro sign or whatever. But if you're in a neighborhood just renting an apartment, then they don't necessarily look at you that way.
That's right. And if you go every morning to the local coffee shop for breakfast and they see you 2 or 3 times, then they become more comfortable with the idea that you're not just there for a day and more likely to strike up a conversation.
And I think a lot of people get real nervous. There's a lot of safety worries out there that are kind of overblown and unfounded. And, every once in a while, yeah, it's possible that you might get scammed somewhere. But I feel like in all the years I traveled, and I'm talking 20 years now, I mean, that's all something really bad as far as losing money has only happened, 2 or 3 times in all that time. And on the other side of the equation, probably 100 times something great has happened, So if you could kind of, of course, have your radar up if something feels dodgy or unsafe or whatever, then say no. But if people invite you to their house for dinner, that's fantastic. Take them up on it because that's such a great cultural experience.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And 99.9% of the people you meet are doing it quite genuinely. And you're right, if you've just got a bit of a radar up and take it cautiously if there's something suspicious going on. But yeah, I think absolutely, it's a much safer world than the sensationalist news likes to tell us.
Yeah, my favorite example is Morocco. I went there before I went. This is quite a while back, but I had read all these Paul Bowles books, and they're all something terrible happens in almost all of his stories. It makes you very paranoid. And it's also known as a country where there's a lot of schemers and scammers out there, just like there is in India and a couple other Egypt, a few other places where you just hear all these horror stories. So I went there, kind of expecting the worst. And we met this guy in the first place we really stayed, which was Chichawan up in the north. But he actually lived in Fez. And he said, hey, I'm going back to Fez, same time you guys are. If you want, I can show you around the city. And, the skeptic in me was going, oh, I don't know about this. What's he trying to get out of the deal? But we went along with it and just trusted him. And he showed us all these cool things that we never would have found on our own, back in the back alleys that only, the people who live there know how to even get to, much less know that, what they're about. And, he just hung out with us for 3 days, showed us around. We went to his house for lunch one day. His wife cooked and everything. And really, he didn't want anything out of it. He just wanted to, practice his English and hang out with some people from another country because he used to travel and now he didn't. And he just wanted the camaraderie. And we actually had to beg the guy at the end to take us to a carpet shop because that's what they always, you're always worried they're trying to push the carpet on you. But we genuinely wanted to buy one, but we wanted to get a decent price. We were going to ship it home. And so we just said, please just take us to a place that we could trust and where we'll get a decent price. We're not trying to, get them down to nothing. We just don't want to overpay. Yeah. And he's like, all right, and he took us. So ended up being this great experience.
Yeah. Well, that's right. Just having a bit of trust and faith, and you can have some great experiences that way. So true. Do you still have the carpet?
Yeah, we do. It's in our living room, and we still love it.
Yeah, my favourite thing about Tim's story is the carpet from Morocco that they still own that their new local Moroccan friend helped them buy reluctantly. It's a great story. So thank you very much for listening to episode 3 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. I hope that if you haven't stayed with locals very often, that these stories might inspire you to give it a go. There'll be some resources in the show notes to some of the sites mentioned today that might just help you do that. If you have stayed with locals and had some interesting experiences, then I'd love you to let me know about them. You can get in touch on Twitter at Amanda Kendall, and you can use the hashtag ThoughtfulTravelPod, or search for Not a Ballerina on Facebook, or head to the show notes, which for this episode will be at notaballerina.com/03. Now let me tell you a little bit about some of our guests today. Craig and Linda Martin, who you've met before, are from the Indie Travel Podcast at indietravelpodcast.com. And when I spoke to them, they were in a co-working space in Colombia. You may have heard a couple of street noises and interruption noises from that co-working space. I just love that I can hear a little piece of Colombia while I speak to them. They also run a WordPress website development and hosting company, which you can find at performancefoundry.com. Kerstin Pilz is from travelpilz.com. That's Pilz. It's her surname. She's German, but it's also the German word for mushroom, which makes it easy for me to remember. but maybe unusual for everyone else to spell. So travelpilz.com is how you'll find Kerstin. We met probably a couple of years ago at one of the Australian pro blogger conferences on the Gold Coast and had lots and lots in common to chat about. And last but not least, Tim Leffel is a travel writer who I've known online for a decade at least. His Cheapest Destinations blog is actually a couple of years older than Not a Ballerina. He started that way back in 2003 when very few people knew what a blog was. But you can also find links to all of his stuff at timleffel.com. He's also written a couple of books. If you're interested in living abroad for less, then he has a great book called A Better Life for Half the Price. And if you're an aspiring travel writer, you might be interested in his book Travel Writing 2.0, which has just gone into its second edition. So as always, these details and more will be in the show notes at notaballerina.com/03. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.
Jackrabbit FM for your ears.
Who is that? Hi, Podcast.